On a narrow strip of Pennsylvania countryside stands what remains of a dream that turned deadly. For decades, this was Liseter Hall Farm, where champion thoroughbreds grazed in rolling pastures and Welsh ponies won ribbons at the nation's most prestigious shows. The three-story Georgian mansion, built in 1922, watched over 800 acres of careful beauty. But this estate was never just a horse farm. Within its boundaries, 3 generations of one of America's wealthiest families played out their ambitions, their eccentricities, and finally, their madness. On January 26, 1996, in a driveway on this property, multimillionaire John du Pont raised a .357 Magnum and fired 3 bullets into Olympic wrestling champion Dave Schultz, while Schultz's wife watched helpless from a window. The third shot entered Schultz's back. Then du Pont returned to his mansion and barricaded himself inside for 48 hours while police surrounded the estate. How did a wedding gift from a railroad executive become the site of one of America's most shocking murders? How did inherited wealth shield a man whose mental illness spiraled into deadly delusions? And what happened to the grand estate where an Olympic dream ended in gunfire? The answers lie in nearly a century of history, at the place that would become known as Foxcatcher Farm. The story begins not with murder, but with a marriage celebrated as the wedding of the century. Before we dive into this haunting story of wealth, madness, and murder, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you enjoy deep investigations into America's grand estates and the dark secrets they hold, please subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into history's most controversial mansions. Chapter 1. The Wedding Gift and the Golden Bloodline. January 1st, 1919. The newspapers called it the wedding of the century, and in the world of American industrial fortunes, the description was not hyperbole. William du Pont Jr. married Jean Liseter Austin in Rosemont, Pennsylvania, uniting 2 families whose wealth had shaped the nation's infrastructure. Jean's father, William Liseter Austin, was an executive at Baldwin Locomotive Works, the company that built the engines pulling America into the 20th century. William's family had built something else entirely, the chemical empire that created nylon and Teflon and the explosives that won wars. The du Pont fortune began with flight from revolution. In 1800, Eleuthère Irénée du Pont fled France with his father Pierre Samuel and brother Victor Marie, carrying little but expertise in gunpowder manufacturing. By 1802, Eleuthère had established a mill on the Brandywine River near Wilmington, Delaware. The location provided everything the operation needed: water to power the works, timber for charcoal, access to the Delaware River for shipping. What started as a single mill became an empire. The timing was perfect, or perhaps perfectly terrible, depending on your perspective. The War of 1812 gave the company its first major profits. The Civil War brought spectacular growth. World War I turned the du Ponts into one of the wealthiest families in America. By the 1920s, the company had expanded far beyond gunpowder into chemicals, synthetics, research and development. They created materials that would reshape daily life across the globe. At the operation's peak, DuPont Enterprises employed 10% of Delaware's entire population. The family fortune in 2016 was estimated at $14.3 billion, spread across more than 3,500 living relatives. William du Pont Jr. was born in 1896 at Loseley Park in Surrey, England, but he grew up American in every way that mattered. His father, William du Pont Sr., had purchased Montpelier in 1900, the Virginia estate built in 1760 by James Madison Sr., later home to the 4th President of the United States. Young William was raised among horses and history, colonial architecture, and championship bloodlines. The passion for thoroughbred racing would define his adult life. Jean brought her own inheritance, not as vast as the DuPonts perhaps, but substantial. Locomotives and chemicals, steam power and chemical innovation. These were the engines that built modern America. The families represented not just wealth, but the industrial machinery that made 20th century life possible. Jean's father gave the couple a wedding gift that most people could barely imagine: more than 600 acres of Pennsylvania countryside near Newtown Square, perfectly positioned in the heart of Philadelphia mainline society. The land sat empty, waiting. The fortune was there. What came next was the house itself. Chapter 2. Building a Replica of History. William du Pont Jr. looked at the empty acreage his son and daughter-in-law had received and saw an opportunity to recreate something he loved. In 1922, he commissioned a mansion for their growing family. The architectural choice was specific and revealing, an exact replica of Montpelier, the estate where he had raised his own children. The original Montpelier had been built in 1760. Its rooms witnessed to the creation of the Constitution, its halls walked by the men who shaped the American Republic. William Sr. had transformed it into a DuPont family seat after purchasing it in 1900. Now he would build a copy in Pennsylvania, transplanting Virginia history into mainline soil. The result was Liseter Hall, named for Jean's family. 3 stories of Georgian revival architecture rose from the Pennsylvania countryside, crowned with a distinctive 4-columned portico that matched Montpelier's facade exactly. The design philosophy was preservation rather than innovation, a house built backward toward the past. What does it mean to construct a replica of history rather than create something new? For the du Ponts, it meant anchoring themselves to American origins, claiming colonial legitimacy through architectural mimicry. The mansion was not simply a house, but an argument about permanence. Old money built copies of old houses. New money built palaces. The du Ponts, despite their relatively recent American arrival in 1800, positioned themselves as custodians of tradition. This would become a family pattern. William Jr. would later remodel his own inherited estate, Bellevue Hall in Delaware, into yet another Montpelier replica. 3 houses, 1 template, repeated across state lines, as if architectural duplication could multiply legitimacy. The workers who built Liseter Hall have left almost no trace in the historical record. We know the mansion was completed in 1922. We know it required skilled labor to execute the precise Georgian details. We do not know their names, their wages, their working conditions, or how many hands shaped the stone and timber. This absence is typical. Grand estates preserve the names of architects and owners, while the people who actually constructed them disappear into silence. The house stood ready to receive the family that would make it famous. William and Jean moved in with their ambitions and their children. 4 would grow up within those walls: daughters Jean Ellen and Evelyn, sons Henry and John. The youngest, John, would not be born until 1938. By then, the estate had already begun its transformation into something beyond a family residence. The mansion needed inhabitants. What arrived was a passion that would define the property for decades. Chapter 3. Thoroughbreds and Welsh ponies. The golden era. Through the 1920s and 1930s, Liseter Hall Farm expanded from 600 acres to approximately 800, absorbing adjacent parcels as William and Jean developed their vision. This would become one of the premier horse facilities in the Mid-Atlantic region, a place where breeding, training, and racing merged into a complete operation. William Jr. established a thoroughbred racing stable in the 1920s, racing his horses under the nom de course Foxcatcher Farm. The name honored his father's first champion horse, carrying forward a family legacy in a new location. The stable produced serious competitors. Most notably, a horse named Rosemont became one of the only thoroughbreds to defeat Seabiscuit, the legendary champion whose races captivated Depression-era America. That single victory placed Foxcatcher Farm in racing history. The farm boasted innovations that other operations lacked. William built the nation's first indoor galloping track, a technological advancement that allowed training to continue through Pennsylvania winters when outdoor tracks became unusable. He also constructed an outdoor riding ring, a dirt racetrack along Route 252, and extensive pastures that gave horses room to develop strength and speed. Every modern facility conceivable for thoroughbred breeding found its place at Liseter Hall. Jean developed her own passion alongside her husband's racing ambitions. In 1928, she began breeding Welsh ponies. What started as a secondary interest became a world-renowned operation. Her ponies earned international recognition for quality and bloodline purity. She appeared at the Devon Horse Show 78 consecutive years, an achievement that spoke to both dedication and the pony's consistent excellence. Champions emerged from her program with reliable frequency. Beyond horses, John maintained a Guernsey dairy herd that had been established on the property in 1916, before the mansion even existed. She also raised hunters for fox hunting, bred a match pack of 13-inch beagles, and assembled an extensive collection of carriages, wagons, and stagecoaches. One of her carriages would eventually appear in the Audrey Hepburn film Breakfast at Tiffany's, a small Hollywood connection to mainline horse culture. The property teemed with carefully bred animals. Thoroughbreds and Welsh ponies and Guernseys and beagles. Each required specialized care, separate facilities, expert handlers. The workforce needed to maintain 800 acres of active farming operations was substantial, though exact numbers have not survived in the historical record. Grooms, trainers, stable hands, dairy workers, groundskeepers, house staff, these workers made the visible beauty possible, though their names have largely been lost to time. Through Pennsylvania springs and summers and autumns, the horses grazed and the ribbons accumulated. 4 children grew up among championship bloodlines and silver trophies, learning to ride before they could properly read. Jean Ellen, Evelyn, Henry, and John, the youngest born in 1938, inhabited a world where breeding mattered, where lineage determined value, where control over animals demonstrated mastery worth admiring. The estate represented both genuine love of horses and social performance. Breeding champions was competition by proxy, a way to prove superiority without stating it directly. Every ribbon Jean's ponies won, every race William's thoroughbreds placed in, reinforced their position in Philadelphia society. The farm was not just agriculture but argument, a daily demonstration of taste, wealth, and dedication to pursuits that required both. But beneath the ribbons and the champion bloodlines, the marriage that had created this world was failing. The reasons remain private, lost to discretion, or simply never recorded. What is clear is that by 1941, after 22 years of marriage and 4 children, William and Jean could no longer sustain the partnership that had begun with such public celebration. Chapter 4. Divorce and a Mother's Kingdom. In February 1941, William du Pont Jr. and Jean Liseter Austin du Pont divorced. John was 2 years old when his father left. The divorce settlement gave Jean what she valued most, Liseter Hall Farm. She retained the mansion, the 800 acres, the breeding operations, the life she had built. William moved to Bellevue Hall, the Delaware estate he had inherited from his father in 1928. There, in a pattern that should surprise no one familiar with the family, he remodeled the Gothic Revival castle into yet another Montpelier replica, creating a third copy of the Virginia estate that seemed to represent some ideal the family could not stop trying to recreate. William remarried in 1947, choosing Margaret Osborne, a tennis champion who had reached the top of women's professional tennis. They had a son, William du Pont III, born in 1952. William Jr. died on December 31, 1965, at age 69. John was 27 years old and had spent most of his life without meaningful contact with his father. John transformed her solo ownership into an empire built on her own terms. She maintained some thoroughbred breeding, but focused increasingly on her Welsh ponies, where her expertise and reputation had already surpassed William's racing accomplishments. Her ponies became among the country's best, earning international recognition that had nothing to do with her married name or her ex-husband's achievements. This was hers. She continued appearing at the Devon Horse Show, year after year, decade after decade, amassing that extraordinary 78 consecutive appearances. She maintained the Guernsey dairy herd of nearly 70 cows. She bred hunters for the Radnor hunt and remained a popular presence in fox hunting circles. The beagles continued their line. The carriage collection grew. Every aspect of the farm reflected her decisions, her standards, her vision. John grew up in this world shaped entirely by his mother's will. His older siblings had memories of their father's presence, however brief. John had only absence. He attended Haverford School, a prestigious preparatory institution. He belonged to the Zeta Psi fraternity at the University of Pennsylvania, though he withdrew before completing his freshman year. Whatever drove him remained unclear to observers then and now. He eventually attended the University of Miami, where he studied zoology under ornithologist Oscar T. Auer, finally earning a Bachelor of Science degree in 1965. The property remained immaculate, a working farm maintained to exacting standards. Jean commanded her kingdom for 47 years after the divorce, running operations until her death in August 1988 at age 91. The ribbons accumulated. The seasons changed. Jean remained in her orbit, never quite establishing an independent identity beyond the shadow she cast. At 50, when his mother died, Jean had lived his entire adult life within the world she controlled, in her house, on her land. She had created something remarkable and sustained it through sheer determination and expertise. The son she raised would take a very different path than horses. Chapter 5. The Heir Who Wanted More Than Money. John Liseter du Pont was born November 22, 1938. The youngest of 4 children in a family whose name carried weight he would never fully escape. After his parents divorced when he was 2, he grew up at Liseter Hall under his mother's care, watching her build a Welsh pony empire while his father remarried and started a second family in Delaware. John had 2 older sisters, Jean Ellen and Evelyn, an older brother Henry, and eventually a half-brother William III from his father's second marriage. He was the youngest, the most isolated, the one who seemed least certain where he fit. His education followed the expected path for someone of his background. He graduated from Haverford School in 1957. He attended the University of Pennsylvania, but withdrew during his freshman year for reasons never fully explained. He eventually found his direction at the University of Miami, studying zoology under the mentorship of ornithologist Oscar T. Auer. In 1965, he earned his Bachelor of Science degree, finally achieving something that was his rather than inherited, and he was good at it. John became a published ornithologist, credited with discovering and documenting new bird species in the Philippines. He wrote scientific papers, contributed to research, and established himself in a field that had nothing to do with gunpowder or chemicals or the Du Pont name. His expertise in ornithology led him to found the Delaware Museum of Natural History in 1957, which opened to the public in 1972 on land donated by his relative Henry Francis du Pont. John served on the board for many years, contributing both money and genuine scientific knowledge. His interests expanded beyond birds. He became an expert conchologist, studying and collecting shells with the same intensity he brought to ornithology. He turned to philately, amassing a stamp collection that eventually included the British Guiana 1-cent magenta, the world's most valuable stamp. When he showed it at an Australian stamp exhibition in 1987, he reportedly slept with it under his pillow rather than trust any available vault. His treatment of the stamp, the poor storage, the constant handling, accounts for its faded condition today, a detail that makes serious collectors cringe. He contributed significant money to Villanova University, enough that the school named a basketball arena after him, the Jean Liseter du Pont Pavilion. The name would not survive his later infamy, but in the 1980s it stood as evidence of his philanthropy and local prominence. By 1986, his personal fortune was estimated at $200 million, the equivalent of roughly $570 million in current currency. He was one of the Forbes 400 wealthiest Americans, a list that included industrialists, technology pioneers, and inherited fortunes from every sector of the economy. The DuPont chemical empire had made him rich beyond most people's comprehension. Yet from early on, people who knew John described him as odd. He called himself America's Golden Eagle, a grandiose nickname that suggested delusions of significance beyond what even his accomplishments warranted. He referred to his more prominent DuPont relatives as the Lesser DuPonts, an inversion that revealed his need to position himself above people whose achievements or social standing exceeded his own. He bought a replica police car and uniform, flashed an auxiliary badge, and pulled people over outside his estate gates, writing official-looking citations for speeding. Whether he understood this was inappropriate or simply did not care remains unclear. He married briefly to a woman named Gail Denny, but the marriage dissolved and left almost no trace in the historical record beyond her name. Details about the relationship, its duration, or why it ended have not survived in accessible sources. In the 1980s, John turned his attention and his money toward athletics. He became interested in swimming, track, the modern pentathlon, and then wrestling. At age 55, despite having only freshman high school wrestling experience, he began competing in Veterans Championships. He traveled to Cali, Colombia in 1992, to Toronto in 1993, to Sofia, Bulgaria in 1995. He took the sport seriously in his own strange way. He donated more than $3 million to USA Wrestling, becoming one of the organization's most generous benefactors. The money bought influence, access, gratitude. It also bought something John seemed to crave more than anything wealth could directly purchase: importance, recognition, the feeling that he mattered for something beyond the surname he carried. Then in August 1988, Jean du Pont died at age 91. For John, the loss was catastrophic in ways that would only become clear later. His mother had been the constant in his life, the person who commanded the estate, who maintained standards, who provided structure even as he moved into middle age. Days after her death, John moved from the smaller house where he had been living on the property into the main mansion, the replica his grandfather had built 66 years earlier. He stood in that doorway, finally possessing the house but having lost the only person who had truly understood him. The year following her death, he would transform her horse farm into something entirely his own. Chapter 6: Team Foxcatcher and the Olympians. In the year following Jean's death, construction crews arrived at the horse farm. What John built next had nothing to do with thoroughbreds. He developed the 440-acre Liseter Hall farm into an elite wrestling training center, creating facilities that rivaled anything available to American amateur athletes at the time. He built state-of-the-art wrestling rooms with specialized mats and training equipment. He constructed an Olympic-sized indoor swimming pool. He added buildings to house athletes and coaches. He created space for competitions and training camps. He named the operation Team Foxcatcher, carrying forward the name his father had used for the racing stable in the 1920s and 30s. The connection was deliberate, a way to honor family legacy while pursuing his own obsession, rather than continuing his mother's Welsh pony breeding or his father's thoroughbred racing. This was John's kingdom now, built on the foundation they had left him. His first major recruit arrived in 1984. Mark Schultz was an Olympic gold medalist in freestyle wrestling, a champion whose talent was matched only by his psychological fragility. Mark came from a broken, peripatetic family. He and his older brother Dave had survived childhood through their bond with each other and their shared excellence on the wrestling mat. Mark saw John initially as a benefactor, someone whose wealth could fund training and allow him to focus entirely on wrestling without financial worry. The relationship evolved from patronage into something stranger. John wanted recognition as a coach despite having almost no expertise. He dressed in Team Foxcatcher gear, traveled with athletes, called himself coach, sought validation from men whose skills he could never match. Mark later described feeling manipulated, caught between gratitude for the financial support and discomfort with John's increasing demands for deference and praise. In 1988, Mark left Team Foxcatcher after what he described as a gun-waving incident, a moment when John's behavior crossed from eccentric into threatening. Mark packed his belongings and walked away from the money and the facilities, choosing distance over dependence. That same year, after Jean died and John inherited full control, Dave Schultz joined Team Foxcatcher. Dave was Mark's older brother, an Olympic gold medalist from the 1984 Games, a world champion in 1983, and a 7-time world and Olympic medalist. He was widely considered one of the greatest wrestlers in American history, a technical genius whose understanding of the sport approached art. He brought his wife Nancy and their children to Pennsylvania, moving into one of the cottages John provided on the property. Dave became assistant coach, the technical expert who actually understood wrestling at the level John only pretended to. More importantly, Dave became the only person who could handle John, who could calm his increasingly erratic moods, who could mediate between John and the other wrestlers when tensions rose. Dave defended John to skeptics, explained away his odd behaviors, maintained that John's love of wrestling was genuine even when his actions seemed motivated more by ego than passion. Other elite wrestlers joined Team Foxcatcher. Kurt Angle, who would go on to win Olympic gold in 1996 and later become a professional wrestling star, trained there. Valentin Yordanov, a Bulgarian Olympic champion, spent time at the facility. Wrestlers came from across the country and around the world, drawn by the state-of-the-art training conditions and the financial support John provided. The early 1990s represented Team Foxcatcher's peak. World-class athletes prepared for international competitions on Pennsylvania farmland, where Welsh ponies had once grazed. The property served new purposes with the same patient indifference it had shown for decades. John traveled to competitions, stood on sidelines, basked in reflected glory. He competed himself in Veterans Championships, treating his participation with the same seriousness he brought to every obsession. In 1993, he hired a security firm to implement protection measures on the estate. The decision reflected his growing paranoia, his increasing conviction that people were watching him, that threats surrounded him, that he needed defending. The security company installed systems, conducted sweeps, but could never find the enemies John believed were there. This was the peak, the moment when everything seemed to be working, when Olympic champions trained at Foxcatcher and John's money served a purpose beyond accumulation. But the man financing this Olympic dream was quietly losing his grip on reality. Chapter 7. The Unraveling Mind. By the early 1990s, people who knew John du Pont had begun to notice something was very wrong. The eccentricities that had always marked his personality, the self-aggrandizing nicknames, the replica police car, the odd behaviors that wealth had allowed people to dismiss as harmless quirks, were hardening into something darker and more disturbing. In 1992, Terry Wochok, the lawyer who had represented John for nearly a quarter-century, called a meeting with 3 psychiatrists to explore whether John could be involuntarily committed to psychiatric care. Wochok had observed the deterioration firsthand and understood that intervention was needed, but Pennsylvania's commitment laws were strict, designed to protect individual liberty even when that liberty posed risks. Unless someone presented an immediate danger to themselves or others, involuntary commitment was nearly impossible. John's wealth meant he controlled his environment completely. He could fire anyone who challenged him. He could pay people to tolerate behaviors that would have gotten someone with less money forcibly hospitalized. The meeting with the psychiatrists concluded that nothing could be done. John remained free, untreated, deteriorating. The delusions multiplied and intensified. Estate workers, wrestlers, visitors, and staff documented a catalog of bizarre beliefs and behaviors that grew more alarming with each passing year. John believed Disney characters were hiding on his property, watching him from the woods and gardens. He thought trees had uprooted themselves and were marching across the grounds. When he saw a flock of geese on the estate, he shot at them, convinced they were using dark magic against him. He removed all the treadmills from the training facility because he believed they were turning back time. He saw bugs under his skin and cut himself trying to remove them. He tore up his mattress searching for animals he believed were hiding inside. He was convinced that Nazis lurked in the trees surrounding the mansion. He installed razor wire in the walls, certain that intruders were trying to break into his home through hidden passages. He ordered workers to search the property for underground tunnels that existed only in his mind. He had them dig holes looking for the bones of a chambermaid he believed was buried somewhere on the grounds. His delusions took on grandiose dimensions. He claimed to be the Dalai Lama and insisted people address him by that title. He said he was Jesus Christ. He announced he was a Russian czar. At various times, he believed he was a CIA operative engaged in covert missions. These were not jokes or performance. They were fixed beliefs that shaped his understanding of reality and his place within it. The security firm he had hired in 1993 found themselves conducting sweeps for threats that did not exist, checking for hidden cameras and surveillance equipment, trying to reassure a client whose paranoia could not be satisfied by any evidence of safety. John drove an armored tank around the property, perhaps carrying the priceless British Guiana stamp in his pocket, convinced that extraordinary measures were necessary to protect himself from enemies only he could perceive. In December 1988, a lawsuit had been filed and later settled out of court, claiming John had made improper sexual advances to Andre Metzger, an assistant wrestling coach at Villanova University. In August 1988, after only 2 years of operation, John shut down a troubled wrestling program he had funded at Villanova. These incidents suggested that even before his mother's death, problems were emerging in how he interacted with the athletes and coaches whose careers depended on his patronage. Friends, athletes, and staff members all expressed concern, but they were powerless to force intervention. He owned everything. They worked for him, trained in his facilities, lived in houses he controlled. Challenging him meant risking their livelihoods, their training opportunities, their homes. The very wealth that enabled his generosity also insulated him from consequences and accountability. Dave Schultz became his defender and his interpreter to the outside world. When people questioned John's behavior, Dave explained it away. When wrestlers complained about John's erratic moods or bizarre demands, Dave mediated. When outsiders suggested John needed help, Dave insisted that John was fine, that his eccentricities were harmless, that his love of wrestling was genuine. The Team Foxcatcher wrestling program continued to operate primarily because Dave could calm John, could redirect his paranoia, could maintain enough stability to keep elite athletes willing to stay and train. But by late 1995, the paranoia had found a focus. Time moved forward. The seasons changed. And inside the mansion, John's grip on reality quietly loosened, his delusions circling closer to the one person who had tried hardest to help him. Chapter 8. 3 shots in a driveway. At 2:41 in the afternoon on January 26, 1996, it was cold, and death had arrived. That morning, John du Pont had driven to an Ardmore stamp store, purchased some collector's stamps, and told the proprietor he would return Monday to pick them up. The transaction was ordinary, unremarkable. He drove back to the estate, the 800 acres he had inherited, the land where he had lived for 57 years. He met with Patrick Goodale, a security guard, and invited Goodale to ride with him around the property to inspect storm damage. Goodale got into the car, unaware of what was about to happen. They drove to the driveway of a cottage on the estate where Dave Schultz lived with his wife Nancy and their 2 children. Dave was working on his car in the cold afternoon air. He was 36 years old, an Olympic champion considered one of the greatest wrestlers in American history, a man whose technical understanding of the sport was matched by his warmth, his generosity, his willingness to mentor younger athletes. He had defended John du Pont for years, explaining away the eccentricities, maintaining that John's contribution to wrestling outweighed his oddness. John's car pulled into the driveway. He lowered the window. He picked up a .357 Magnum revolver from the front seat. The gun was not his usual weapon. He normally carried a smaller caliber .38. He aimed at Dave and asked, "You got a problem with me?" He fired 3 shots into Dave's body. The first 2 struck center mass. Dave fell. The 3rd bullet entered his back while Nancy Schultz watched from a window, helpless and horrified. She ran to the phone and called 911. When the operator asked why John du Pont had shot her husband, Nancy replied with the only explanation that made sense to her. Because he's insane. John drove back to the mansion with Goodale still in the car, an eyewitness to murder. He locked the gun in his safe. The shell casings were never recovered, likely disposed of immediately. He told his staff that if police arrived, they were not to let them in. Then he barricaded himself inside the mansion, the house his grandfather had built as a replica of James Madison's Virginia estate, and began a standoff that would last 48 hours. Police surrounded the property. 800 acres of Pennsylvania countryside became a crime scene. Officers took positions around the perimeter. Negotiators began calling the mansion, trying to talk John into surrendering. He stayed inside, moving through rooms where his mother had raised him, where he had lived most of his life, refusing to emerge. Friday night, the police turned off the power and heat to the mansion. Pennsylvania temperatures in late January could drop well below freezing. The strategy was simple: make staying inside unbearable. Force him out into custody. John endured the cold through Friday night and all day Saturday, negotiating by telephone but refusing to leave. Sunday, January the 28th. The strategy worked. John left the mansion to fix the boiler that heated the house. Police moved in and arrested him outside. He was charged with first-degree murder and taken to Delaware County Prison. Dave Schultz's body had already been removed from the driveway where he fell, carried away to a morgue while the Olympic wrestling community tried to comprehend what had happened. No clear motive was ever established. The theories varied. Some believed John had developed a paranoid delusion that Dave was a Russian KGB agent involved in an international conspiracy to kill him. Others thought John was jealous of Dave's genuine expertise, resentful that Dave possessed the wrestling knowledge John could never acquire despite all his money. Still others suggested John feared Dave was planning to leave for a coaching position at Stanford University, abandoning Team Foxcatcher and withdrawing the stabilizing influence he had provided for years. Dave Schultz was murdered. John du Pont's mind had already been lost. The estate stood silent under winter skies, its buildings painted the matte black John had ordered years earlier, its grounds surrounded by police tape and investigators. The mansion looked down on crime scene technicians, photographing a driveway stained with blood. Nearly a century of Du Pont family history had led to this moment, but nothing could have prepared the property for what it had witnessed. The legal question became, was this murder or madness? Chapter 9. Guilty but mentally ill. John du Pont was taken to Delaware County Prison. The question now was whether he could even stand trial. In September 1996, a competency hearing was scheduled before Judge Patricia Jenkins. On the eve of the hearing, John fired his lawyers, Richard Sprague and William Lamb. He believed they were conspiring against him with the district attorney's office, part of the same web of conspiracies that had convinced him Dave Schultz was a Russian agent. His paranoia was in full bloom, his delusions undimmed by incarceration. Thomas Bergstrom took the case just 5 days before the competency hearing. For a lawyer who had devoted his career to criminal defense, this was both an extraordinary professional opportunity and an almost impossible challenge. The client was one of the wealthiest murder defendants in American history, a man whose mental illness was obvious to anyone who spent time with him, but whose legal competency and criminal responsibility were questions that would require extensive psychiatric evaluation to resolve. In September 1996, John was ruled incompetent to stand trial. Judge Jenkins ordered him sent to Norristown State Hospital for psychiatric treatment. Building 51 housed the forensic unit where the criminally mentally ill received care. John described it as a death camp and called his therapist part of a filthy communist conspiracy to create a new world order. Progress notes from his treatment revealed that staff viewed him as withdrawn, guarded, and suspicious. He presented with paranoid delusions and grandiose thinking, his grip on reality fractured beyond what conversation could easily repair. Doctors began a regimen of antipsychotic medication. They started with Haldol at 10 milligrams twice daily, along with cogentine at 1.5 milligrams to manage side effects. Eventually, they placed him on olanzapine at 10 milligrams. The medications worked slowly, bringing his psychotic symptoms under enough control that he could participate in his own defense, though they could not erase the underlying illness that had led to murder. In December 1996, a second competency hearing was held. This time, Judge Jenkins found John competent to proceed to trial. The legal standard for competency was narrow. Could he understand the charges against him, and could he assist his counsel in his defense? The answer, after months of medication and treatment, was yes. The trial was set for January 27, 1997, exactly 1 year and 1 day after Dave Schultz's murder. The trial lasted 7 weeks. Both the prosecution and the defense agreed on one fundamental point. John du Pont suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. The psychiatric experts called by both sides confirmed the diagnosis. Where they disagreed was on the legal question. Defense attorney Thomas Bergstrom argued that John was legally insane at the time of the shooting, that his delusions about Dave being a Russian KGB agent conspiring to kill him meant he could not distinguish right from wrong. District Attorney Patrick Meehan argued that despite the mental illness, John knew what he was doing was wrong. He had used a different gun than his usual weapon. He had locked the gun in his safe after the shooting. He had told staff to keep police out. He had engaged in a 2.5-day standoff. These actions, Meehan contended, showed awareness of wrongdoing. Witness after witness testified about John's bizarre behaviors over the years. Estate workers described the delusions about Disney characters and marching trees and dark magic geese. Staff members recounted the razor wire in the walls, the searches for underground tunnels, the claims to be the Dalai Lama or Jesus Christ or a Russian czar. Athletes who had trained at Team Foxcatcher explained how Dave had been the only person who could calm John, the only one who could mediate and maintain stability. The psychiatric battle dominated the proceedings. Both sides presented expert witnesses who had evaluated John extensively. The diagnosis was not disputed. The legal implications were everything. Under Pennsylvania law, a defendant could be found not guilty by reason of insanity, guilty but mentally ill, or simply guilty. Each verdict carried different consequences for where John would be housed and how he would be treated. One piece of evidence particularly troubled the prosecution's case for premeditated murder. John had brought Patrick Goodale with him as a witness. Why would someone planning a murder take an eyewitness along? The defense argued this proved John did not understand he was doing something wrong, that the presence of Goodale meant nothing to him because his delusions had convinced him he was acting in justified self-defense against a Russian agent. On February 25, 1997, after 7 weeks of testimony and psychiatric evaluation and legal argument, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty but mentally ill of third-degree murder. Also guilty of simple assault. The verdict acknowledged both realities. John had killed Dave Schultz, and John was severely mentally ill. He was not legally insane under the narrow definition the law required, but neither was he a cold-blooded murderer who had killed without the influence of disease. Judge Patricia Jenkins sentenced him to 13 to 30 years in prison. He would be eligible for parole after 13 years on January 29, 2009. His maximum sentence would end January 29, 2026, when he would be 87 years old. He was returned initially to Norristown State Hospital for continued psychiatric treatment, with the understanding that he would eventually be transferred to prison once his mental condition stabilized enough to allow it. The first parole hearing came in 2009. The request was denied. John would remain incarcerated. The sentence had been delivered. The legal process concluded. While John du Pont lived in a prison cell, the estate he had inherited began its own slow death. Chapter 10. Decay, Death, and Demolition. The manicured lawns grew wild. Paint peeled from barns John had ordered painted black. The estate he had lived on for 57 years began to rot. While John sat imprisoned, Liseter Hall Farm spent 14 years in a state of abandonment and decay that would have horrified his mother. From prison, John issued strange orders that revealed his state of mind. He commanded that the gate sign be changed to read Foxcatcher Prison Farm, as if the estate itself had become an extension of his incarceration. He had already ordered all the buildings painted matte black years earlier, including Dave Schultz's cottage where the murder occurred. The interpretation of this act remained unclear. Was he trying to erase the evidence? Was he in mourning? Or had his illness simply fixated on the color black, in the same irrational way it fixated on Disney characters and marching trees? In the fall of 1996, shortly after his arrest, John sold the Guernsey dairy herd his mother had maintained for decades. Nearly 70 cows were dispersed. In January 1998, the Delaware Museum of Natural History, which John had founded and formerly headed, sold the 230-acre dairy farm portion that had been held in trust. The sale brought $15.3 million to help fund the museum's operations. The land John's mother had carefully stewarded for 47 years was broken apart and sold to the highest bidder. In 2008, the Episcopal Academy, a private independent school founded in 1785, purchased 123 acres of the estate and built a new campus there. The school moved from split campuses in the nearby mainline communities of Marion and Devon to this consolidated location. Students now attend classes on land where Olympic wrestlers once trained and where before that Welsh ponies had grazed. Meanwhile, the main estate property deteriorated. Weeds sprouted through carefully maintained gardens. Some horses remained, roaming pastures that no one tended. The mansion stood empty, its windows dark, its rooms silent. For years, John had believed ghosts lived in the walls of that house. Now it began to look like a haunted house. In truth, paint fading, shutters hanging loose, the careful beauty of 1922 architecture surrendering to weather and neglect. Local residents had hoped the land would remain open space, preserved as a reminder of an agricultural past rapidly disappearing under suburban development. Their hopes were disappointed. Newtown Township had no historic preservation ordinance. The Newtown Square Historical Society had documented approximately 30 structures from the 1800s scattered across the property, but documentation provided no protection. Weather and time did their work. Paint peeled, wood rotted, weeds pushed through asphalt. On December 9, 2010, Jean Liseter du Pont died in prison at age 72. He was found unresponsive in his bed at the State Correctional Institution in Laurel Highlands, Somerset County, Pennsylvania. He was pronounced dead at 6:55 in the morning at UPMC Somerset. The official cause of death was chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. He had lived 14 years after killing Dave Schultz, long enough to watch appeals fail and parole denied, but not long enough to see the maximum end of his sentence. He was buried in a red Foxcatcher wrestling singlet, in accordance with instructions in his will at the Du Pont de Nemours Cemetery in Wilmington, Delaware. Even in death, he claimed identity through the wrestling program that had ended in murder. His will bequeathed 80% of his estate to Valentin Yordanov, the Bulgarian Olympic champion who had trained at Foxcatcher, and Yordanov's relatives. 20% went to the Eurasian Pacific Wildlife Foundation, an organization John had founded to support Pacific wildlife conservation. His own family received nothing. In June 2011, his niece Beverly du Pont Gaugal and nephew William du Pont filed a petition in Media, Pennsylvania, challenging the will. They argued John had not been of sound mind when he made these provisions, citing his delusions that he was alternately Jesus Christ, the Dalai Lama, and a Russian czar. The petition was dismissed. An appeal followed, but the Superior Court of Pennsylvania upheld the dismissal. The will stood. Shortly before or after John's death, the estate was sold to Rouse Properties for $28.5 million. Rouse called their planned development Ashford. In December 2012, Toll Brothers, a company specializing in luxury home construction, purchased approximately 440 acres from Rouse Properties. In January 2013, demolition began. Glenn Miller. Demolition razed the 90-year-old Liseter Hall mansion that had stood since 1922. The architecture, the four-columned portico, the rooms where 4 generations of DuPonts had lived, all of it came down. Approximately 30 DuPont-era structures were demolished. Barns that had housed championship thoroughbreds and Welsh ponies. Cottages where Olympic wrestlers had lived. The wrestling facility where world champions had trained. The indoor swimming pool, buildings from the 1800s that predated even the DuPont ownership. Nearly everything was erased. Only one structure survived. A 7,000 to 9,000 square foot carriage barn that had once housed Jean du Pont's collection of prize-winning horses. Toll Brothers had decided this single building was worth preserving, not for historical reasons, but because it could be repurposed into something profitable. What rose from the demolition dust was something Marjorie Merriweather Post might have understood. Luxury marketed to those who could afford the entry price. Chapter 11. Liseter Reborn. From murder site to luxury address today. Where the mansion once stood, luxury homes rise in neat rows. Toll Brothers, recognizing both the property's dark history and its premium mainline location, made a strategic choice about how to market the land where an Olympic champion was murdered. They would acknowledge the past while emphasizing an older, more palatable legacy. They named the development Liseter, returning to the original 1922 name, honoring the horse farm era rather than the Foxcatcher wrestling tragedy. The project was conceived as a master-planned, age-targeted community of 449 luxury homes on 440 acres. The development would unfold in 4 phases over approximately a decade, transforming 800 acres of DuPont family history into contemporary suburban living. The housing types varied to attract different buyers. Townhomes offered $2,400, to 2,600 square feet of living space, starting in the $500,000 to $600,000 range. Single-family homes range from 4,000 to 5,000 square feet, on lots sized from 30,000 square feet up to nearly 2 acres, with prices reaching $1.1 million. The total projected build-out value approached $325 million. Toll Brothers hired designer Mary Cook to restore the preserved carriage barn into a $4.5 million community clubhouse. Cook approached the project with attention to the building's history. She kept the soaring foyer and large stone fireplace that had been original features. Old wooden partitions that once separated horse stalls became wainscoting on the walls. A barn door was converted into a sliding door for a conference room. A stone wall that had been part of the structure became the backdrop for a lavish bar. An old tack trunk found in storage was repurposed as an end table. Cook discovered more than 1,000 ribbons from the prize-winning horses John du Pont had bred over decades. She framed several hundred of them, creating wall displays that honored the estate's equestrian legacy. The clubhouse became the centerpiece of amenities that included a swimming pool, fitness center, tennis courts, and walking trails throughout the development. A retractable wall in the main gathering space provided views of the surrounding grounds, allowing residents to see the land much as Jean du Pont might have seen it, though now divided into lots and streets rather than continuous pastures. When potential buyers asked about the property's history, Toll Brothers' sales staff answered directly. They did not hide the murder or the trial or John du Pont's mental illness. Transparency became part of the sales strategy. The development was honest about its past while emphasizing that the past was exactly that: past, finished, transformed. By January 2015, 123 homes had been sold. Buyers were not deterred by the knowledge that Dave Schultz had died in a driveway that no longer existed, on land now occupied by someone's front lawn. The Wall Street Journal featured the project in 2015, focusing on the adaptive reuse of the carriage barn and the challenge of marketing a property with such notorious recent history. Philadelphia Magazine covered the development as well, treating it as an interesting case study in how historical trauma could be acknowledged without preventing profitable development. The stone and iron entry gate was preserved, providing continuity with the original estate. Some landscaping attempted to maintain a pastoral feeling, echoing the rolling pastures that had once defined the property. But the transformation was total. Where John du Pont had driven an armored tank, families now drove SUVs to swim practice. Where Olympic wrestlers had trained, children rode bicycles on sidewalks. Where Dave Schultz had worked on his car in his driveway, someone parked a minivan each evening after commuting home from Philadelphia. No memorial marks the spot where Dave Schultz died. His legacy lives elsewhere, in wrestling awards bearing his name, in Hall of Fame plaques, in the memories of athletes he coached. The land itself offers no acknowledgement of what happened there in January 1996. The physical estate may be transformed, but the story refuses to be paved over. Chapter 12. The Dark Legacy: What Foxcatcher Taught Us. The Foxcatcher story became more than one man's descent into madness. It became a mirror showing Americans things about themselves, some flattering, some deeply uncomfortable. John du Pont remains the only member of the Forbes 400 wealthiest Americans ever convicted of murder, a statistical anomaly that highlights just how rarely extreme wealth and criminal violence intersect at the highest levels of society. The case exposed fundamental problems in how American systems handle mental illness when the patient possesses extraordinary financial resources. In 1992, when John's lawyer called a meeting with psychiatrists to explore involuntary commitment, Pennsylvania law required that someone present an immediate danger to themselves or others before commitment could be forced. John's wealth meant he controlled his environment completely. He could fire anyone who challenged him. He could pay people to tolerate behaviors that would have resulted in hospitalization for someone with fewer resources. The system designed to protect individual liberty from government overreach had no mechanism to help someone this rich and this sick. Workers at the estate found themselves trapped between needing employment and witnessing dangerous deterioration. They saw the delusions, heard the paranoid accusations, observed behaviors that clearly indicated severe mental illness. But challenging John meant risking their jobs. Speaking out meant potential retaliation. They needed the wages he paid, depended on the housing he provided, feared the consequences of honesty. The silence that allowed John's illness to progress unchecked was maintained by economic necessity. The athletes who trained at Team Foxcatcher faced similar constraints. They depended on John's patronage for training facilities, coaching, financial support, and housing. When Dave Schultz defended John's eccentricities to skeptics, he was protecting both his benefactor and his own position. The loyalty that kept Dave at Foxcatcher, mediating John's paranoia and maintaining stability, became fatal. He stayed when others left, trusted when others grew wary, and paid for that trust with his life. USA Wrestling had to reckon with having accepted more than $3 million from a donor whose mental stability was increasingly questionable. The organization faced criticism for not conducting better oversight, for not questioning John's fitness to run a training facility, for prioritizing funding over athlete safety. The wrestling community's response revealed how difficult it is to refuse money when budgets are tight and opportunities scarce. The case highlighted gaps in mental health commitment laws that remain unresolved. The balance between protecting individual liberty and providing necessary treatment tilts heavily toward liberty, even when liberty enables suffering and danger. Wealth amplifies this imbalance by allowing the mentally ill to construct private worlds where their delusions face no external reality check. The cultural fascination with Foxcatcher has proven enduring. In 2014, director Bennett Miller released the film Foxcatcher, starring Steve Carell as John du Pont, Mark Ruffalo as Dave Schultz, and Channing Tatum as Mark Schultz. The film earned critical acclaim and multiple Oscar nominations, including Best Actor for Carell's unsettling portrayal of John's awkward narcissism and deteriorating mind. In 2015, ESPN's 30 for 30 documentary series aired The Prince of Pennsylvania, featuring interviews with former Team Foxcatcher wrestlers and John's ex-wife. In 2016, Netflix produced Team Foxcatcher, a documentary that used archival footage and contemporary interviews to explore what happened at the estate. Mark Schultz wrote a memoir, Foxcatcher. The true story of my brother's murder, John du Pont's madness, and the quest for Olympic gold, which became a New York Times bestseller. True crime coverage continues to revisit the case, drawn to the combination of Olympic achievement, inherited wealth, mental illness, and murder. The story endures because it refuses simple interpretation. John was both mentally ill and dangerous, victim and perpetrator. Dave Schultz was both loyal friend and enabler of dysfunction. The estate was both beautiful architecture and the setting for tragedy. Wealth both created opportunities for athletic excellence and shielded mental illness from intervention. Every attempt to reduce the story to a single moral fails because the reality contained too many contradictory truths. Nancy Schultz founded the Dave Schultz Wrestling Club after her husband's murder, keeping the training program alive through the 1996 Olympics and beyond. She supported 20 displaced athletes from Team Foxcatcher, providing them with resources when the estate closed. In 2013, the California chapter of the National Wrestling Hall of Fame gave her the Lifetime Service to Wrestling Award. In 2018, the Hall of Fame presented her with the Order of Merit Award. Her work transformed grief into service, ensuring that Dave's legacy lived in athletes helped rather than in the manner of his death. Wrestling organizations established the Dave Schultz High School Excellence Award in 1996, celebrating outstanding high school wrestlers who demonstrated success in competition, scholastic achievement, and community service. In 2016, United World Wrestling posthumously inducted Dave into its Hall of Fame. The wrestling world chose to remember him for what he built rather than how he died. John is remembered differently. Most tellings cast him as villain, though some recognize the tragedy of severe mental illness left untreated. The question of responsibility remains unresolved. Was this John's fault or his diseases? Was it the system's failure for lacking mechanisms to intervene? Was it the family's failure for not forcing help earlier? Was it American wealth culture that treats financial success as evidence of competence, even when all other evidence suggests otherwise? The land where all this happened has been transformed. But what about the questions it raised? The story that began with a wedding gift ends with suburban driveways and landscaped walking trails. Where John du Pont once drove an armored tank, families now walk dogs. Where Olympic wrestlers trained, children ride bicycles. Where Dave Schultz died in a driveway, someone parks a minivan each evening. The transformation is total. Yet the questions Foxcatcher raised have no such neat resolution. The estate revealed fundamental contradictions in American life about wealth and accountability, about mental illness and the limits of intervention, about the distance between those who own and those who work, about what we choose to preserve and what we are willing to erase. The DuPont family story stretches back to 1802, when a gunpowder mill on the Brandywine River launched one of America's great fortunes. That fortune funded Liseter Hall's construction in 1922, sustained the thoroughbred operation that made Foxcatcher Farm legendary in racing circles, supported Jean's Welsh pony empire through 5 decades, and finally bankrolled John's wrestling dreams until those dreams fractured into nightmares. The same wealth that built something beautiful, a mansion and champion horses and an Olympic training center, also shielded its last owner from the help he desperately needed. Money meant John could fire lawyers trying to commit him. Money meant workers who witnessed his delusions kept working rather than risk losing employment. Money meant he controlled enough of his environment to seem functional even as psychosis consumed him. Foxcatcher sits at the intersection of America's most uncomfortable conversations, about inherited wealth and what responsibility comes with it, about mental health care systems designed for those without resources to fight back, about how we value physical spaces. The barn was preserved because it could be monetized. 30 historic structures were demolished because they could not. About labor that builds and maintains luxury while remaining invisible until something goes terribly wrong. Liseter Development is a private gated community. No public access, no tours, no memorial markers. The only preserved piece of the original estate, the carriage barn turned clubhouse, serves current residents, not history-seeking visitors. Episcopal Academy occupies 123 acres, where part of the farm once stood, but it is a functioning school, not a historic site. Dave Schultz's legacy lives elsewhere, in wrestling awards bearing his name, in Hall of Fame plaques, in the club his widow founded, in the memories of athletes he coached and inspired. On a winter afternoon in 1996, 3 gunshots ended an Olympic champion's life and revealed what happens when enormous wealth insulates mental illness from intervention. The mansion that watched over it all is gone now, reduced to rubble in January 2013. But the story remains uncomfortable and unresolved, a warning about American excess in all its complicated, tragic forms. What you choose to remember from this story says something about what you believe matters: the horses or the murder, the mansion or the workers who maintained it, the Olympic dreams or how they ended. All of it happened on the same 800 acres. All of it is true,